What did David do after becoming king that caused his fame to grow? This is the question we seek to answer today as we continue our verse-by-verse study of the book of 1 Chronicles on walking through the Bible.
The glory of his cross.
Today we're going to be discussing 1 Chronicles chapter 14, verses 1 to 17. Before we do that, let's read the passage. If you have a Bible with you, turn to 1 Chronicles chapter 14, verse 1. But if you don't have a Bible, don't worry. Just follow along with us on the screen. The version that we'll be reading from is the New King James Version. So 1 Chronicles chapter 14, beginning at verse 1. Now Hiram king of Tyre sent messengers to David and cedar trees with masons and carpenters to build him a house. So David knew that the Lord had established him as king over Israel, for his kingdom was highly exalted for the sake of his people Israel. Then David took more wives in Jerusalem, and David begat more sons and daughters. And these are the names of his children whom he had in Jerusalem: Shemua, Shobab, Nathan, Solomon, Ibhar, Elishua, Eliphelet, Noga, Nepheg, Japhia, Elishama, Beliada, and Eliphelet. Now when the Philistines heard that David had been anointed king over all Israel, all the Philistines went up to search for David. And David heard of it, and went out against them. Then the Philistines went and made a raid on the valley of Rephaim. And David inquired of God, saying, Shall I go up against the Philistines? Will you deliver them into my hand? The Lord said, Go up, for I will deliver them into your hand. So they went up to Baal Perazim, and David defeated them there. Then David said, God has broken through my enemies by my hand like a breakthrough of water. Therefore they called the name of that place Baal Perazim. And when they left their gods there, David gave a commandment, and they were burned with fire. Then the Philistines once again made a raid on the valley. Therefore David inquired again of God, and God said to him, You shall not go up after them, circle around them, and come upon them in the front of the mulberry trees. And it shall be, when you hear a sound of marching in the tops of the mulberry trees, then you shall go out to battle, for God has gone out before you to strike the camp of the Philistines. So David did as God commanded him, and they drove back the army of the Philistines from Gibeon as far as Gezer. Then the fame of David went out into all the lands, and the Lord brought the fear of him upon all nations. When reading the scriptures, we need to be careful that we don't think that the chronicler is giving an exact chronology of events. In the last chapter, we saw David's first attempt of bringing the Ark of the Covenant back to Jerusalem, an attempt which failed because they put the ark on an ox cart. The oxen stumbled, and Uzzah put out his hand to steady the ark and immediately died. This caused David to have the ark placed in the house of Obed-Edom until David determined what to do. As we come to chapter 14, we might think that what is revealed here is what happened in the intervening months, but we would be wrong, especially when comparing this with our study of 2 Samuel, which has both of these events before the events concerning the Ark of the Covenant. But even without that, we should know that this isn't a chronology here, for chapter 14 verse 13 said that the ark was in the house of Obed-Edom for 3 months. What happens in this chapter could not possibly have occurred in 3 months, so even without prior study of Scripture, we would come to the conclusion that the chronicler is giving us a summary. In fact, it is a summary that began soon after David became king and took Jerusalem. The first thing we learn is that David made a treaty with Hiram, king of Tyre, that would allow David to trade with Tyre for wood and workers, enabling David to build a palace in Jerusalem. This palace would be within the boundaries of Jerusalem when it was at its smallest area, but the building would be grand compared to all the other buildings in Jerusalem. It is quite possible, if not likely, that this house was in the process of being built when David attempted and later succeeded in moving the ark to Jerusalem. When the palace was built, David was now a king in title, power, and prestige, proving to him that the Lord had indeed established him as king over Israel and highly exalted him. However, there was one thing that David did that, though God tolerated it, would be something that would lead to his downfall, which was that he took even more wives in Jerusalem than he already had. Before David got to Jerusalem, David already had 7 wives and 6 sons, one each by these women with the exception of Michal, David's first wife, who bore him no children. Having 6 wives is already 5 more wives than God desired, but again, it's something that God tolerated in the Old Testament due to the hardness of man's heart. He doesn't tolerate such today with his fully revealed word, which is why God's divorce and remarriage laws in Matthew 19 are much stricter. The chronicler doesn't mention anywhere how David came to have one of his wives, Bathsheba, but we know that it was through adultery with her and then the murder of her husband. Why does he leave this out? Because again, the chronicler's aim is not to give us a complete history of the nation of Israel, but growth of the nation under David, which led to the organization of the temple worship through David. So he chose to only mention those things important to that narrative. David and Bathsheba, according to 1 Chronicles 3 verse 5, would have 4 sons who lived. Those first 4 mentioned here in 1 Chronicles 14 verse 4. The other 9 would be born to David in Jerusalem via different women, just as we saw back in 1 Chronicles 3. Coming now to verses 8 to 17, and we likely step back in time slightly once again to around the time that David actually took Jerusalem, which is the time he battled the Philistines. We studied these battles back in 2 Samuel 5, verses 17 to 25, as evidence that David was going to be different than Saul in that he was actually able to subdue the Philistines. When comparing the 2 accounts, even though the wording is slightly different, what they are telling us is the same thing. There are actually 2 battles being spoken of here. The first one takes place when the Philistines deploy themselves in the Valley of Rephaim. The Valley of Rephaim is located south and west of Jerusalem, in between Jerusalem and Bethlehem. It is said that when David heard of what the Philistines were doing, he went out against them. Where he went out exactly is unknown, but many speculate that what is being talked about is that David went to the stronghold at Adullam, one of the places that David hid from Saul while on the run, located near the Valley of Elah to the southwest of the Valley of Rephaim. From there, David inquired of the Lord whether he should go up against the Philistines, and the Lord affirmed that he should, for the Lord would deliver the Philistines into his hands. And so David fought against them and repelled them. So quick was the attack that the Philistines had left their idols behind that they had brought, probably thinking that these idols would assure them victory. Of course, these idols were nothing but man-made objects, with the true God of heaven fighting on David's side. David burned the idols instead of keeping them as spoils, showing us David's faithfulness in not only not putting stumbling blocks before himself about idols, but not putting them in front of the people either. However, David didn't utterly defeat the Philistines, allowing them to retreat. For some time later, how much time we're unsure, the Philistines returned to the Valley of Rephaim to fight Israel again. This time, though, when David inquired of the Lord told David not to go directly against them, but to circle around behind them and attack there. This likely means that for this second attack, David was in a different place than the first attack, for the direction that David will chase the Philistines in battle was from the south to the north and then west. So if David was to circle on behind the Philistines, he must have been situated here in the north or the east, which would make sense, as the second battle was later than the first battle. The second battle was different than the first, though, for David didn't just beat them in the Valley of Rephaim, he drove them back to Gezer, which was one of the northern cities of the Philistines. The route that David took should sound familiar to regular viewers of this podcast, for from the Valley of Rephaim, David drove them north to Gibeon in Benjamin, then west through the Bethoron Ridge, and back through the Ajalon Valley to the Philistine territory. Defeating the Philistines here wouldn't be David's final defeat over them, but it would be his first as king. And because he defeated this major power in the region, this began to grow David's fame among the nations, striking fear in their hearts not to cross him, or they could be next. The chronicler said that this was the Lord's doing, but as we've seen elsewhere, it's not that the Lord forces people to be afraid against their will, but men, seeing the Lord's actions working through David, is what strikes fear in their hearts. Thus, it is the Lord's action in providing David victory that produces the fear, because they know their gods cannot perform those deeds. It is thus not an overpowering of the mind and the will by God done against our will. It is this fear, though, that enabled David to conquer as far as he did, expanding Israel's territory and influence to places it had never dreamed of before. But the Ark of the Covenant was still not in Jerusalem. David was that mighty king. He had done those mighty deeds. And yet because he didn't consult God's word before moving the ark, God chastened him for it. That will change in chapter 15, when we will see the ark successfully move to Jerusalem, this time by obeying the word of the Lord. So we invite you back for that lesson. With that, our time is up for today. We will be taking another one-day break and will return, the Lord willing, on Monday, April 1st, 2024. When we return, we'll take up with 1 Chronicles chapter 15, verses 1 to 15. We hope that you'll come back and join us in that discussion when we will continue our walk through the Bible, one verse at a time. Thank you for watching today's episode. We hope that you found it edifying and ask that you not only subscribe to our channel and podcast, but that you like and share this episode among your friends, so that the saving gospel of Jesus Christ can go out to the whole world.